The ruined millionaire fakes a life of luxury, but his seamstress makes him feel what is real. He had lost everything, except for his appearances. And to save what was left of his empire, he needed her, a seamstress who was never afraid of him, who never bowed down. And because of that, she was the only one who managed to truly touch him. It was just an agreement, a charade. But all it took was one unscripted glance, one touch that wasn't in the contract. And the most feared man in the country found himself a prisoner of the woman he thought he was buying. And this time, there was no escape. Pardon the interruption to your story, but if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe. Bless this channel by helping us grow, and may that kindness be returned to you twofold. Thank you, and enjoy the video. The penthouse on Park Avenue still gleamed with a luxury that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, fading. From the panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows, New York City sprawled out like an ocean of light that had once belonged entirely to Julian Vance. On that crisp October afternoon, the rays of the setting sun sliced through the Italian silk curtains, revealing what the twilight shadows tried to conceal. Porcelain vases with dusty artificial flowers, cut crystal glasses unused for months, and that silence. The profound, cavernous silence that only inhabits places where fortune has abandoned its masters. Julian held several documents in his trembling hands. At 45, his premature silver temples gave him a distinguished air that clashed violently with the raw desperation in his eyes. He had built a real estate empire from the ground up, a skyline of steel and glass forged by his own will, but now the entire edifice was crumbling beneath his feet. "There's no other option, Julian," insisted Sebastian Cole, his lawyer and the only friend who remained by his side. "The investors from Dubai are interested, but they need to see stability. They need to believe you're still the same titan you've always been." "Stability?" Julian let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Sebastian, I can barely make the full payroll this month. What stability are you talking about?" Sebastian walked to the window, his reflection a dark silhouette against the city that had witnessed the rise and fall of so many men like Julian. "That's why you need to maintain appearances. 3 months, Julian. That's all we need. 3 months of pretending everything is fine, of attending the right events, of smiling for the cameras with the right woman on your arm. After that, once the Arabs sign, you can rebuild everything." Julian ran his fingers through his hair, a wave of memories crashing over him. Dozens of women who had paraded through this very penthouse back when he was the most eligible bachelor in Manhattan. They had all vanished at the first whisper of his downfall, like ghosts at sunrise. "And who in their right mind would want to be my +1, knowing I'm on the verge of ruin?" he asked, the bitterness coating every word. Sebastian placed a sleek leather folder on the marble coffee table. A single name was elegantly typed on the label: Helena Ross. "Someone who owes you a favor," the lawyer replied. "Or rather, someone whose brother owes you a great deal of money." The memory struck Julian like a physical blow. Helena Ross, the seamstress, the designer, who had crafted the bespoke uniforms for his boutique hotel chain. The woman with amber-colored eyes who had dared to argue with him over fabric choices and stitching techniques, holding his gaze when everyone else on his payroll lowered their heads in deference. The same woman whose brother Matthew had secured a substantial loan from him to expand their workshop, only to disappear with the money, leaving her to shoulder the crushing weight of the debt. "Helena?" Julian murmured, feeling a strange, unfamiliar jolt at the sound of her name on his lips. "You think she'll agree to this?" "She has no choice," Sebastian said, a cold, pragmatic smile touching his lips. "The contract is already drafted. Either she plays the part of your devoted partner for these 3 months, or we execute the debt against her workshop. She would lose everything she's ever worked for." Something tightened in Julian's chest. It wasn't remorse, he told himself fiercely. It was survival. This was business, nothing personal. Helena's workshop in Soho was small, but flooded with natural light. Bolts of vibrant fabrics stood in colorful columns against the exposed brick walls, and the rhythmic hum of a sewing machine filled the space with its constant creative energy. At 32, Helena had managed to keep the business afloat, despite her brother Matthew's betrayal, pouring her own blood, sweat and tears into every stitch. Her expert hands guided a swath of midnight blue velvet under the needle when the bell over the door chimed, announcing a visitor. The silhouette of Sebastian Cole filled the doorway, blocking the afternoon light. Helena stopped the machine, her foot lifting from the pedal, and recognized him instantly. The man in the $1,000 suit who represented the man who held her future in his hands. "Ms. Ross," he greeted, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "May we have a word?" Helena stood with quiet dignity, smoothing down the front of her simple A-line skirt. "If you're here about Matthew's debt, you know I'm paying what I can each month," she said, her voice steady and firm. Sebastian placed a thick manila envelope on her cutting table, pushing aside a pattern paper. "I'm not here to collect, Ms. Ross. I'm here to offer a solution. Mr. Vance requires your services." Helena picked up the envelope, her fingers cautious, and slid out a multi-page document bound in a legal cover. Her eyes, wide and disbelieving, scanned the first few clauses. "Is this a joke?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and outrage. "He wants me to pretend to be his girlfriend." "His official partner," Sebastian corrected smoothly, "for 3 months. In exchange, the entire debt, all $250,000 of it, will be forgiven in full." Helena dropped the contract on the table as if it were on fire. "Tell Mr. Vance I'm not that desperate." Sebastian's cold smile returned. "Aren't you? The debt, with interest, is substantial. At your current rate of payment, you'll be free and clear in, 20 years? Meanwhile, your brother is enjoying himself who knows where, and you're sinking a little deeper every single day." Helena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She hated to admit it, hated the bitter taste of truth in his words, but he was right. Every month was a battle for survival, a desperate scramble to pay her suppliers, her rent, and the 5 employees who depended on her. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "There are hundreds of women who would kill to be with him, even knowing he's in trouble." Sebastian paused for a moment, his gaze analytical. "Because he specifically asked for you." Something shifted in Helena's expression, a memory sharp and vivid. The day she had stood her ground against Julian Vance during the uniform design presentation. She had told him his choice of fabric was impractical and would fray within 6 months, costing him more in replacements. He had stared at her, his initial annoyance slowly melting into something that looked startlingly like respect. "I need to think about it," she said, stalling for time she didn't have. "You have until tomorrow morning," Sebastian replied, turning toward the door. "And Ms. Ross, Mr. Vance expects you at his residence tonight at 8. Don't be late." The private elevator opened directly into Julian's penthouse. Helena stepped out, her stride determined, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She wore a simple yet elegant dress of her own design, a deep navy blue that made the amber in her eyes seem to glow. Julian was waiting by the window, a glass of scotch in his hand. When he saw her, an unreadable emotion flickered across his usually impenetrable features. "Helena," he said, his voice a low baritone, "thank you for coming." "I wasn't given much of a choice, Mr. Vance," she replied, her tone as cool as the autumn air outside. He moved closer, his eyes appraising her from head to toe. She was still as he remembered, a quiet, understated beauty that had intrigued him from their very first meeting. "I assume Sebastian explained the situation." "You want me to be your arm candy to impress some investors," Helena summarized bluntly. "To save your empire while mine is falling apart." Julian's jaw tightened. "Your empire," he said, a note of irony in his voice, "crumbled because of your brother's actions, not mine." "And yet you're using his debt to manipulate me," Helena shot back, looking him directly in the eye, refusing to be the one to look away first. "Has the great Julian Vance fallen so far?" A flash of something, anger, shame, perhaps both, lit his eyes. "We all do what's necessary to survive," he answered, his voice dropping. "Do you accept the terms or not?" Helena held the contract in her hands, the paper a tangible symbol of her gilded cage. "With one condition," she said finally. "A condition?" he asked, surprised that she would dare to negotiate from a position of such weakness. "I will never, under any circumstances, bow my head to you. I won't be another one of your frightened employees or your dazzled conquests. If you want this to work, we will be equals." Julian stared at her for a long, silent moment. This woman, who had next to nothing, was daring to impose terms on him, the man who had once had everything. Equals. A wry, almost pained smile touched his lips. "Very well, Helena. Equals it is." He extended his hand to seal their pact. As she took it, a jolt of unexpected electricity shot up her arm. Their eyes met, challenging, proud, and utterly defiant. In that moment, neither could possibly imagine how that cold, transactional contract would irrevocably change their lives. The Metropolitan Museum of Art glowed under the strategically placed lights that illuminated its grand Beaux-Arts facade. A procession of limousines and black town cars pulled up to the red carpet, where a frenzy of photographers and journalists waited to capture the arrival of the celebrities, tycoons, and socialites attending the annual charity gala for arts conservation. Helena took a deep breath before the chauffeur opened her door. She wore a wine-red gown she had designed and sewn over 3 sleepless nights, a masterful cut that hugged her figure with timeless elegance, with subtle hand-stitched beading that caught the light with every movement, and a neckline that hinted at allure without sacrificing sophistication. Her dark hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, framing a face that held a natural grace that stood in stark contrast to the surgically enhanced ostentation of many of the other guests. Julian stepped out first and offered her his hand. He wore a flawlessly tailored tuxedo that expertly concealed the immense strain he was under. His smile, rehearsed for hours in front of a mirror, looked almost genuine. "Remember," he whispered through clenched teeth as they posed for the cameras, the flashbulbs popping like fireworks. "Tonight, we are the perfect couple." Helena took his hand, her grip firm. "You don't need to remind me of my role, Julian." The museum's Great Hall was a swirling vortex of the New York elite. Politicians, financiers, artists, and heiresses navigated a sea of priceless art and hollow conversations. Helena moved with the self-assurance of someone who belonged in this world, even though she felt like a complete imposter. It did not go unnoticed by Julian that several heads turned to follow her, their gazes filled with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "Who is Vance's new woman? They say she's a designer. Didn't you hear his company is on the brink of collapse?" The whispers reached them in scattered fragments as they made their way through the crowd. Julian greeted acquaintances with his usual practiced poise, introducing Helena simply as "my partner," without offering further detail. She responded with polite smiles and intelligent remarks, but without the fawning submission he had half expected. She didn't lower her eyes to anyone, didn't laugh too loudly at vapid jokes, didn't seem the least bit starstruck by the immense wealth surrounding her. "Smile more," Julian commanded in a low murmur as they accepted flutes of champagne from a passing waiter. "I am smiling," she replied without changing her placid expression. "If you wanted a doll that grins on command, you should have hired an actress." Before he could retort, a familiar, unwelcome voice cut through the tension between them. "Vance, what a surprise to see you here. I thought you'd be too busy liquidating assets to pay off your debts." Adrian Sterling, the owner of a rival hotel empire and Julian's former business partner, approached with a malicious grin. He was a portly man, squeezed into a tuxedo that was a size too small, his entire demeanor radiating schadenfreude. "Sterling," Julian replied, his own smile tight and strained. Always one to exaggerate the rumors. Adrian's predatory eyes landed on Helena, appraising her with blatant disrespect. "I see you've found a new distraction," he said, emphasizing the last word. "I always did admire your taste for the exotic. I suppose when the king is falling, he needs more affordable comforts." Helena felt Julian tense beside her, the tightening of his jaw betraying the volcanic rage he was barely containing. Before he could say something that would shatter their carefully constructed facade, she linked her fingers with his, pressing her body against his with a startling and convincing familiarity. "Actually," Helena said, her voice soft but laced with steel, "Julian and I met long before I had any idea who he was." She turned to Julian, gazing up at him with a look of such perfectly feigned tenderness that for a second, even he believed it. "What I fell in love with was his vision, not his bank account." But while her lips smiled, her eyes sent a different message. "Play along with me, or you'll go down alone." "Precisely," Julian continued, recovering his composure as he drew her closer. "Helena sees beyond the surface, a rare quality in our circle, wouldn't you agree, Adrian?" Sterling's face hardened, his attempt at public humiliation expertly neutralized. "We'll see how long this romance lasts," he sneered before turning and disappearing into the crowd. The rest of the evening was a blur of superficial conversations and tentative business promises that both of them knew might be Julian's last hope. To his astonishment, Helena navigated the treacherous social waters with a disconcerting ease, holding her own among people who would normally have dismissed her out of hand. She answered questions about fashion with expert knowledge, spoke of art with genuine passion, and most importantly, created the perfect illusion of an adoring, supportive partner whenever curious eyes fell upon them. The journey back in the limousine was thick with a tense silence until, finally, Julian could no longer contain himself. "What the hell was that?" he exploded once the privacy of the vehicle enveloped them. "You were supposed to follow my lead, not take the initiative." Helena looked at him calmly, as if his outburst were nothing more than a childish tantrum. "Are you referring to the moment I saved you from making a complete fool of yourself in front of that man?" she countered, her composure only fanning the flames of his anger. "You're welcome, by the way." "I didn't need you to save me," he growled. "I've been handling hyenas like Sterling for years." "Really? Because it looked like you were about to lunge at him like a cornered animal," Helena retorted, removing the borrowed diamond earrings and sighing. "Look, if we're going to do this for 3 months, you might as well accept that I'm a much better actor than you thought. Tonight you were the one going off script." Julian stared at her, torn between his fury and a grudging, uncomfortable admiration. She was right. She had handled the situation with a grace and cunning he hadn't anticipated. "Don't ever make a move like that again without consulting me," he said finally, though his voice had lost its authoritative edge. "I can't promise you that," she replied, holding his gaze in the dim light of the car. "But I can promise that every decision I make will be to protect this charade you so desperately need." Silence descended between them once more. When they reached Julian's building, he showed her to the guest suite as they had agreed for the nights of their public appearances. They said goodnight with the stiff formality of 2 business partners trapped in an inconvenient arrangement. That night, in separate rooms connected by a single thin wall, neither of them could sleep. Julian, lying in his king-sized bed, replayed the feeling of Helena's fingers laced with his, the warmth of her body pressed against his side, and that fleeting moment when her eyes had communicated more than words ever could. On the other side of the wall, Helena stared at the ceiling, remembering the intensity in Julian's gaze when he had introduced her as "my partner," the way his hand had rested protectively on the small of her back all night, and how, for one dizzying instant, the lie had almost felt true. They both knew it was only the beginning of a dangerous game, one where the lines between performance and reality were destined to become terrifyingly blurred. New York Fashion Week had become one of the most important events on the global social calendar. Designers from around the world showcased their collections in iconic venues across the city, drawing in celebrities, investors, and fashion lovers. For Julian, it was a perfect stage to prove he was still a major player. For Helena, it was stepping onto familiar ground, but from a completely different and elevated position. They arrived at the main event with the calculated elegance of an established couple. 2 weeks of public appearances had polished their performance to a near-perfect shine. Now, their hands found each other's without thinking. Their bodies naturally leaned toward one another in conversation, and they shared conspiratorial glances that fooled even the most cynical observers. The main runway show had just concluded in a thunder of applause when Julian leaned into Helena, his voice an urgent whisper in her ear. "I have a problem." Helena looked at him, her practiced smile faltering with genuine curiosity. In his dark, grey Italian designer suit, Julian Vance was the very personification of masculine perfection, but following her discreet gaze, he noticed the top button of his jacket hanging precariously by a single thread. "Sebastian can just buy me another one," he said dismissively, scanning the bustling backstage crowd for his lawyer. "Don't be ridiculous," Helena replied firmly, her practical nature overriding the glamour of the moment. "I can fix that in 2 minutes." 10 minutes later, they had secured access to an empty dressing room tucked away behind the main stage. The space was small, cluttered, and intensely illuminated by the globe lights framing a large mirror. Julian shrugged off the jacket, handing it to her with a certain reluctance. "I've never let anyone mend my clothes before," he confessed, his tone a strange cocktail of arrogance and vulnerability. Helena produced a small emergency sewing kit from her clutch, a professional habit she never abandoned. "There's a first time for everything," she responded with a faint smile as she threaded a needle with practiced precision. Julian watched her work. Her fingers moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering their craft, creating nearly invisible stitches as she secured the button. The air was thick with the scent of hairspray and anticipation. "Why did you never get married?" Helena asked suddenly, her eyes still focused on her task. The question caught Julian completely off guard. He tried to deflect it with his usual cynical armor. "Marriage is for men who need to either prove something or secure something. I've never needed to do either." Helena continued to sew, but a skeptical smile played on her lips. That's the answer you give in interviews. It's not the truth. A spark of irritation flashed in Julian's eyes. And now you're an expert on my life. No, she answered calmly, not missing a beat. But I recognize when someone is avoiding a question that hurts. An uncomfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the soft whisper of thread passing through wool. Julian watched his own reflection in the mirror, as if searching his own face for the answer he didn't want to voice. My father had 3 wives, he said finally, his voice lower, more intimate than she had ever heard it. Each one younger than the last. He didn't love any of them. My mother was the first. She was the only one who truly loved him, and she was the one who suffered the most when he left her for his secretary. Helena glanced up briefly, her expression softened by surprise at his candor. I watched her waste away for years, Julian continued, his gaze distant, waiting for phone calls that never came, scanning the society pages where he'd be photographed with his new family. His voice hardened with the memory of old pain. I swore I would never do that to anyone, and the best way to ensure that was to never commit at all. Helena nodded slowly, acknowledging the weight of his words. My father left us when I was 8, she said, her own voice quiet but steady, a stark contrast to the turmoil of the memory. One day he just went out for a pack of smokes and never came back. My mother worked 3 jobs to support my brother and me. Her fingers continued their delicate work as she spoke, a seamless rhythm of creation amidst a story of destruction. That's why I don't trust men who think they own the world. Because when the world turns its back on them, they turn their back on the people they're supposed to protect. Julian felt the sting of her words as a direct indictment. We're not all the same, Helena. No, you're not, she conceded, tying off the thread with a final perfect knot. But you're not as different as you think. Your solution was to never commit. Mine was to never depend on anyone. In the end, we're both afraid of the same thing, giving someone else the power to shatter us. The observation struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever read him with such unnerving accuracy. He wanted to argue, to defend his life's philosophy, but the words caught in his throat. There, Helena announced, biting the thread clean with her teeth in a gesture that was both professional and deeply personal. Better than new. She handed the jacket back to him. As Julian put it on, she stepped closer to adjust how it settled on his shoulders. The small space shrank, and their bodies were suddenly inches apart. She reached out to smooth his lapel, and her fingertips brushed against the fine fabric of his shirt, a fleeting touch over the frantic beating of his heart. Time seemed to freeze. Julian's gaze dropped to her, and he noticed details he'd somehow missed before. The tiny, almost invisible scar near her left eyebrow, the natural length of her dark lashes, the slight tremor in her lips as their eyes finally met. Without thinking, without calculation, he captured the hand that rested on his chest, holding it firmly in his own. This wasn't a gesture for the cameras. No one was watching. It was a raw impulse, born from a place he refused to name. The silence in the room became charged, humming with unspoken meaning. Helena didn't pull her hand away, but her eyes were a whirlwind of confusion and alarm, as if she was suddenly realizing they were playing with wildfire. Julian held her hand for a second longer than was necessary. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he remembered who he was, what was at stake, and abruptly let her go, taking a step back. His features hardened, the mask of the ruthless businessman falling back into place. Thank you for the repair, he said, the formality a jarring contrast to the intimacy of the moment before. We should get back. I have investors to impress. Helena nodded, her own mask of composure slipping back on as she gathered her small sewing kit and tucked it into her purse. When she walked out of the dressing room, a faint blush colored her cheeks that no makeup could replicate. They returned to the event separately, maintaining a careful distance for the rest of the evening. But for both of them, something had fundamentally shifted. In that tiny, cluttered dressing room, amidst confessions and thread, they had unwittingly stitched a connection that went far deeper than the contract that bound them. The historic Hudson Valley estate had been reserved for an exclusive weekend retreat, a gathering of titans where entrepreneurs, politicians, and celebrities would discuss investments in new luxury tourism projects. For Julian, it was perhaps his final, most critical opportunity to secure the capital he so desperately needed. His main presentation was scheduled for the following day, and Helena, as she had been for the past 6 weeks, would be by his side, flawlessly playing the role of his devoted partner. No one had anticipated the storm that slammed into the region that October night. The sky turned a bruised purple before darkening prematurely, and rain began to fall with a ferocity that seemed intent on uprooting the ancient trees surrounding the property. At 9 o'clock, a crack of lightning struck a nearby electrical substation, plunging the entire area into darkness. "Power should be back shortly," the estate manager assured the guests, distributing candles. "The emergency generator only covers the main common areas." Most of the attendees congregated in the grand salon, where the massive stone fireplace provided warmth and waiters served wine to ease the wait. But Helena, exhausted after a full day of forced smiles and feigning interest in vapid conversations, slipped away to a covered stone terrace overlooking the lake, now an invisible black expanse. She didn't expect to find Julian there, sitting alone with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "It's not a Bordeaux Grand Cru," he said as he saw her, holding up a bottle of local vintage. "But the sommelier assured me it's the best New York has to offer." Helena hesitated for a moment before joining him. In the weeks since that charged moment in the dressing room, an unspoken tension had settled between them. It was a constant humming awareness they both tried to ignore, yet it seemed to grow with every furtive glance, every accidental brush of their hands. She sat across from him, accepting the glass he offered. The rain hammered a rhythmic, soothing tattoo on the terrace roof, creating a bubble of intimacy that insulated them from the rest of the world. "You should be in there charming your investors," she commented, taking a sip of the rich, dark red. Julian leaned back in his chair, the flickering candlelight carving shadows onto his weary face. "I'm tired of pretending tonight," he admitted, with a raw honesty that surprised them both. "Besides, Sebastian is better at it than I am." Helena let out a soft laugh. The great Julian Vance admitting someone does something better than him. It must be the end of the world. To her surprise, he laughed too. It wasn't the controlled, modulated laugh from their public appearances, but a genuine, almost vulnerable sound. "Perhaps it is," he replied, raising his glass in an ironic toast. "To the end of the world as we knew it." They clinked their glasses and drank in a comfortable silence. The storm raged outside, but on that candlelit terrace they had found a strange pocket of peace. "Do you know what the ambassador's wife said about us?" Helena remarked after a while, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "That we're refreshingly modern, because we don't engage in tacky public displays of affection like the other couples." Julian snorted. "If only she knew we've never even kissed, and that we sleep in separate rooms," she added. "And that this entire thing is an elaborate piece of theatre, to save my reputation and your workshop." They continued to list their deceptions, finding an unexpected pleasure in the shared intimacy of a secret no one else knew. As the wine level in the bottle lowered, so did the carefully constructed barriers between them. "Why is it so important to you?" Helena asked finally, her voice softer now. "This empire, why not just start over? Something smaller, without all this pressure?" Julian's expression darkened. For a long moment, the only sound was the relentless drumming of the rain. "Because failure isn't an option," he answered at last. "Not after everything I built from nothing. Not after all the people who watched me rise and are now just waiting to see me fall." His voice cracked almost imperceptibly. "If I fail, I go back to being the scholarship kid from the wrong side of the tracks who clawed his way into their world." Helena looked at him with new eyes, understanding for the first time the true, desperate nature of his ambition. It wasn't just about money, it was about identity. "I'm afraid of going back to being invisible," she confessed in turn, surprising herself with the admission. "Before I had my workshop, I worked for years in the garment district, a stock girl. Nobody knew my name. Nobody looked me in the eye. I was just part of the inventory." She drank the last of her wine. "Now, when we walk into a room, everyone looks at me. I know it's a lie that they're looking at your partner, but sometimes I wonder what it would be like if it were real. Their gazes locked across the table, stripped bare of all pretense. For the first time, they weren't the arrogant millionaire and the proud seamstress. They were just a man and a woman, defined by their fears, their dreams, and their wounds." Slowly, Julian stood and walked around the table until he was standing beside her. He leaned in, placing one hand on the back of her chair. Helena held her breath as he raised his other hand to gently brush a stray strand of hair from her face. "You have never been invisible to me," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel straight through her. His fingers lingered on her cheek, a touch as light as a whisper. This wasn't part of the act. There was no one to impress. This was just Julian touching her because he needed to. Helena closed her eyes, surrendering to the sensation. When she opened them again, his face was much closer, the silent question hanging in the air between them. She didn't pull back. The kiss came with the slow inevitability of a rising tide, tentative at first, a fearful exploration of uncharted territory. Then, as if some internal dam had broken within them both, it deepened into something urgent, hungry, a wordless confession of everything they had been repressing for weeks. Julian's hands tangled in her hair as she clutched the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. Time suspended. They were no longer actors playing a part. They were simply a man and a woman finding each other in the heart of a storm. It was Helena who broke it off, pulling back abruptly. Her amber eyes were wide with confusion and alarm, as if waking from a trance. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling slightly. "We can't do this," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "This isn't real. This isn't—" "Helena!" Julian reached for her, but she recoiled. "I'm sorry," she said, running a hand through her hair. "You're right. It was a mistake. The wine, the storm." But they both knew it wasn't the wine or the storm. It was something that had been building between them from the very beginning, something they had desperately tried to ignore. "I should get to bed," Helena said finally, her voice strained. "Tomorrow is a big day for you." Julian nodded, unable to find the right words. He watched her retreat into the main house, taking the warmth they had shared with her. That night, neither of them slept. Separated by century-old walls, they each confronted the same terrifying truth. They weren't pretending anymore. And that was the most dangerous reality of all. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was dripping with elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the space, where New York's business elite had gathered to celebrate the launch of a new art foundation. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and gourmet canapés, while a string quartet played softly in a corner. Helena and Julian had arrived together, as they had for the past 2 months. Their dynamic had subtly shifted since that night in the Hudson Valley. They never spoke of the kiss, but it hung between them like a ghost, charging every glance, every brief touch, with unspoken meaning. "I'm going to say hello to Martinez," Julian said, indicating an old contact across the room. "He's important for the Cancun project." Helena nodded, secretly grateful for a moment alone. Since the retreat, Julian always seemed coiled with tension around her, as if he feared any proximity might unleash something uncontrollable. She made her way to the bar to order a glass of white wine, when a voice beside her spoke. "Excuse me, you're Helena Ross, the designer, aren't you?" Turning, she found a young man, no older than 35, with bright, intelligent eyes and a genuinely curious smile. Unlike most men in that room, his interest seemed sincere, not calculated. "Yes, that's me," she replied, studying him. "Ethan Rhodes," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "I just moved my VC fund back from London. We specialize in backing creative direct-to-consumer brands. I saw your work featured during Fashion Week. It's extraordinary." Helena couldn't help but feel a warmth spread through her chest. He was praising her, the creator, not fawning over the woman on a billionaire's arm. "Thank you, though I haven't had much time for new designs lately." The conversation flowed with surprising ease. Ethan knew the fashion world, but he also spoke about literature, cultural policy, and the challenges for independent artists. Helena found herself laughing, truly laughing, forgetting for a few blissful moments the orchestrated role she was there to play. From across the ballroom, Julian watched the scene unfold while pretending to listen to his interlocutor. An unfamiliar fire burned in his gut as he saw Helena smile like that, with a freedom and light she never showed with him. He saw the way she leaned in slightly when the young man spoke, the way her eyes sparkled with an enthusiasm he recognized but had never been the cause of. "Excuse me for a moment," he interrupted Martinez without waiting for a reply. He crossed the room with measured steps, schooling his expression into one of polite neutrality. When he reached Helena's side, he placed a possessive hand on the small of her back. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your new friend?" he asked, a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Julian Vance." Helena made the introductions, a hint of surprise in her tone. "This is Ethan Rhodes. He runs a venture capital fund for creative companies." "Fascinating," Julian replied with cool civility. "Though in my experience, funds that specialize in creativity often have returns that are equally imaginary." Ethan remained composed, though his smile tightened. "Actually, Mr. Vance, Our first fund in London saw a 27% return in 2 years. Creativity, when properly channeled, can be extremely profitable. Julian is intimately familiar with returns on investment, Helena interjected, a barely veiled edge to her voice. His company was one of the most successful in the country. The choice of the past tense hung in the air, a deliberate strike that did not go unnoticed by either man. It still is, Julian corrected harshly, his grip on her back tightening. Darling, they're waiting for us at the main table. They excused themselves from Ethan with forced politeness. As they walked away, Helena felt Julian's hand on her back like a branding iron. What was that? She whispered, as soon as they were out of earshot. What are you referring to? He replied, his gaze fixed straight ahead. You know exactly what I'm referring to. You practically insulted that man for no reason. Julian guided her into a discreet alcove, away from the prying eyes of the other guests. That man wasn't interested in your designs, Helena, he said, his voice low and strained. He was shamelessly hitting on you. She stared at him in disbelief. And that bothers you? Why? This is just a charade, remember? A contract. You don't own me. This isn't about ownership, Julian countered, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as a clear sign of his fraying composure. Your behavior could compromise our credibility as a couple. Helena held his gaze, an incredulous smile forming on her lips. My behavior? Or are you afraid I might actually be interested in someone real? Someone who sees the designer, not just the arm candy for the great Julian Vance? The verbal blow landed exactly where she'd aimed. Julian fell silent, his face shuddering, becoming an impenetrable mask once more. Without another word, he turned and walked away, rejoining the cluster of businessmen where Sebastian was waiting. The rest of the evening unfolded under a blanket of barely concealed tension. They played their parts to perfection for the audience, but the chasm between them had widened into a canyon. When they returned to Julian's building, they parted ways with the cold formality of strangers. That night, sleep eluded Helena. The words from their confrontation echoed in her mind as she tossed and turned in the guest suite. It wasn't fair for him to treat her like a possession, and yet a traitorous part of her wondered if his reaction had been genuine, if beneath the layers of pride and pretense, he truly cared. Around midnight, she made a decision. Rising from the bed, she found a cardboard box she'd brought with her when she'd temporarily moved in. Inside were photos, sketches, newspaper clippings, the fragmented history of her life's work. She carefully selected a few items and placed them in a small, elegant wooden box. Slipping out into the silent hallway, she paused outside his bedroom door and gently slid the box underneath it. Inside, Julian wasn't sleeping either. The soft scrape of the box sliding across the hardwood floor startled him. Intrigued, he rose from his bed and retrieved it. When he opened the lid, he found photos of Helena's workshop in its early days, original sketches of the hotel uniforms, a local news article about emerging designers featuring her name. And then he saw it, a photograph from 3 years ago, taken at the presentation event for his hotel chain's new uniforms. In the picture, Julian stood beside Helena, both smiling for the camera. He had no memory of the specific moment. It was just one of hundreds of similar corporate events, but what stole the air from his lungs was the way she was looking at him in the photograph. It wasn't the look of an employee or a contractor. It was a look of genuine admiration, of respect, that had nothing to do with his net worth or his position on some magazine's power list. It was for the man he had been, or the man she had believed him to be. He sank onto the edge of his bed, holding the small photograph as if it were a fragile, priceless artifact. He remembered how he had treated her tonight, the irrational jealousy that had consumed him, the fear of losing her that he didn't even dare name to himself. And for the first time in years, since the slow, agonizing collapse of his empire began, Julian Vance allowed himself to cry. The tears that flowed were not for his lost fortune or his endangered reputation. He was crying for something infinitely more valuable, something he had only just discovered and now feared he would never deserve: Helena's heart. On the other side of the wall, Helena listened to the profound silence, wondering if her message had arrived too late. The May morning dawned with a golden light that streamed through the vast windows of Julian's penthouse. Helena had risen early, preparing for the charity gala to be held that evening at the Guggenheim Museum. It was one of the most important events of the season, and quite possibly the final opportunity for Julian to close the deal with the Dubai investors before her contract with him expired. In the past few weeks, A strange, fragile peace had settled between them. After the incident at the plaza, something had changed. They hadn't spoken directly about the box of photographs, but Julian had begun to treat her differently, with a new gentleness, an almost reverent care, as if he were afraid of breaking something precious that was just beginning to heal. Helena went to the Home Office to collect some documents Sebastian had left for review. She needed to confirm a few details about the guest list to ensure the evening went off without a hitch. The office was empty. Julian had left at dawn for a preliminary meeting. As she searched through the meticulously labeled folders on his desk, her hand accidentally brushed against a slightly ajar drawer. It slid open, revealing a plain red folder with no label. She hesitated. She had no desire to invade Julian's privacy, but something about the folder felt important. Peeking out from the edge, she recognized the official seal of the New York State Economic Development Council. Her heart began to pound. With a deep breath, she pulled the folder out and opened it on the desk. The first document was stamped, Confidential Peninsula Project. Beneath it were transcripts of phone calls, surveillance photos of meetings in exclusive Manhattan restaurants, copies of wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, and several highlighted names, including Adrian Sterling's. Helena began to read, and with every page, she felt the air being squeezed from her lungs. This was no simple business proposal. It was evidence of a massive corruption scheme involving the State Development Council, several of the city's most powerful hotel developers, and government officials. The plan was as simple as it was devastating: to illegally rezone protected wetlands and divert public funds to build luxury resorts, destroying a vital natural habitat. And there, amongst the printed emails, she found one from Julian, sent to the entire group. "Gentlemen, I appreciate the invitation to participate in this project, but I must decline. I will not endanger my employees or tarnish my company's reputation by engaging in operations that undermine the environmental heritage of this state. I ask that you do not contact me again regarding this matter." The reply from Sterling, dated a week later, was chilling. "Vance, your decision has been noted. So will the consequences. No one walks away from an opportunity like this without paying the price. We'll be sure to remember you when you're picking through the ruins." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in Helena's mind, with cruel clarity. The sudden tax audits of Julian's companies, the mysteriously cancelled projects, the denied loans, the major clients who vanished overnight. It hadn't been bad luck or financial recklessness. It had been a calculated, systematic revenge, a lesson to anyone who dared to remain incorruptible. Deeper in the folder, she found an internal memo from Julian to his legal department. "Under no circumstances will the true nature of our financial situation be disclosed to our employees. They will be paid to the very last day, even if it requires the liquidation of my personal assets. These people have placed their trust in us. We will not betray that trust." With trembling hands, Helena put everything back exactly as she had found it and closed the drawer. She sank into the leather armchair by the window, trying to process what she had just discovered. The man she had judged as arrogant and selfish, the tycoon she believed cared only for appearances, had sacrificed his entire empire to protect his employees and stay true to his principles. The Julian Vance the world knew, the one she herself thought she knew, was merely a shadow of the man he truly was. The Guggenheim Gala was everything it promised to be: extravagant, exclusive, and shimmering with power and money. Under the soaring ceilings of the iconic rotunda, surrounded by masterpieces of modern art, New York's elite mingled with foreign dignitaries and international celebrities. Helena entered on Julian's arm, more aware than ever of the invisible weight he carried on his shoulders. The gown she had chosen for the night was perhaps her masterpiece, a design in cascading shades of gold and amber that caught and reflected the light, making her glow like a living flame in the crowd. Throughout the evening, Helena watched Julian with new eyes. She saw the immense strength it took to maintain his smile while negotiating with men who might have been part of the cabal that destroyed him. She noted the quiet dignity with which he greeted former partners who had abandoned him, and she admired more than ever how he protected his small circle of remaining loyal employees, making sure to mention them by name and praise their work to potential new clients. When Adrian Sterling appeared with his wife, a cold fury unlike anything she had ever felt seized Helena. The man who had orchestrated Julian's downfall approached them, his face a mask of poisonous smiles. "Vance, what a surprise. I thought you'd be too busy with legal matters these days," he said, the sneer barely veiled. Helena felt Julian tense beside her, but before he could respond, she stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Sterling, how unfortunate to run into you. We were having such a pleasant evening." Sterling's smile faltered at the icy edge in her voice. "Always so protective, Ms. Ross. I wonder if you truly know the man you're with." "I know him better than anyone," Helena replied, holding his gaze with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step back, "and I have never been prouder to stand by his side." When Sterling walked away, visibly flustered, Julian looked at her with a mixture of confusion and profound gratitude. They had no chance to speak for the rest of the event, too busy navigating a sea of potential investors and old allies who were suddenly reconsidering their distance. It wasn't until late into the night, as they rode back to the penthouse in a silent taxi, that Helena finally spoke. "I saw the documents, Julian, the red folder. I know everything." The taxi moved down Park Avenue, the city lights painting fleeting shadows across their faces. Julian remained perfectly still, his profile a rigid silhouette against the window. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said at last, his voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Why would you let me think you had failed because of recklessness or greed?" When they arrived at the building and entered the elevator, Julian still hadn't answered. Only when the penthouse door closed behind them did he turn to face her. "Because the truth doesn't change the outcome," he said, his voice laced with exhaustion. "I'm still ruined, and revealing what I know would only put more people in danger." Helena moved toward him, and for the first time since they'd met, she was the one to initiate a touch, cupping his face in her hands. "It changes everything for me," she said softly. "I thought you were a man who would sacrifice anyone to save his image. Now I know you sacrificed your image to save everyone else." For the first time since Helena had known him, Julian Vance looked down, not in defeat but from the overwhelming weight of being truly seen, of having someone know his truth and not run away. When he looked up again, his eyes held something she had never witnessed in him before: absolute vulnerability. "I don't want to pretend with you anymore, Helena," he whispered. "I'm so tired of the masks." She smiled, a sad, respectful smile. "Then let's stop," she replied, and the silent agreement between them morphed into something entirely new, something real and as fragile as the coming dawn. The State Department had announced a gala dinner in honor of several European ambassadors. The event, held at the magnificent New York Public Library, represented Julian's last grand opportunity. The Dubai investors had shown genuine interest after the Guggenheim event, but they had yet to commit. Tonight, they might finally sign the preliminary agreement. The penthouse had become a war room. Sebastian bustled in and out with documents, while Julian's personal assistant reviewed the names and connections of every important guest. In the midst of this controlled chaos, Helena worked quietly in her room, making the final adjustments to the gown she had designed for the occasion. 3 days had passed since she discovered the truth. 3 days of charged glances and half-finished conversations. The very air between them had changed, as if an invisible wall had crumbled, leaving them both exposed. Helena glanced at the calendar on her phone. Her contract officially expired the next day, 3 months to the day since she had agreed to become the fake partner of Julian Vance. 3 months that had upended her life in ways she could never have imagined. She retrieved the original contract from her purse, its edges now soft from handling. The clauses, the conditions, the signatures, it all seemed absurdly clinical to describe what had transpired between them. A piece of paper couldn't possibly contain their shared moments, the whispered confessions, the kiss in the storm, or the discovery of the true man behind the arrogant mask. With a sigh, she made her decision. Carefully placing the finished gown in a garment bag, she left her room and walked to the office where Julian was nervously pacing, reviewing his presentation notes. "I need to talk to you," she said from the doorway. Julian looked up. The dark circles under his eyes told of sleepless nights, his face etched with the strain of holding up a crumbling facade for months. "Can it wait? The Arabs will be there tonight, and I need to go over these numbers one last time." "No, it can't wait," Helena replied firmly, closing the door behind her. "Our contract is over tomorrow." The silence in the room was heavy, absolute. Julian dropped the papers on his desk and sank into his chair, bracing himself for an inevitable blow. "I know," he said finally. "Sebastian has the severance papers and the cancellation of your brother's debt ready. I'll give them to you tonight, after the event." Helena walked to the desk and, without a word, placed the original contract in front of him. Then, under Julian's astonished gaze, she took it by the middle and ripped it in 2, then 4, then 8, until it was nothing but a pile of unrecognizable scraps. "What are you doing?" he demanded, jumping to his feet. "I'm ending the lie," she replied, her voice calm, belying the storm inside her. "I don't want to pretend anymore, Julian. I can't walk out on that stage one more night and pretend we are something we are not." Julian's face went pale, his expression shifting to one of raw panic. All his composure, all his carefully cultivated arrogance disintegrated in an instant. "Helena, please," his voice cracked. "Just tonight, I'm begging you. The investors are expecting to see us together. The entire plan, everything, depends on us keeping up appearances until the deal is closed." She looked at him for a long moment, taking in every detail of his face, the fine lines around his eyes, the almost faded scar above his right eyebrow, the tension in his jaw. This man, who had once seemed like an arrogant tyrant, now stood before her, utterly stripped of his defenses. "I'm not going tonight," she said at last. Julian closed his eyes, a look of pure defeat washing over him. When he opened them again, they were filled with resignation. "I understand," he said, his voice hollow. "After everything you've discovered, after how I treated you at the beginning, you have every right to leave. Sebastian will bring you the papers tomorrow, and—" "You don't understand," Helena interrupted, taking a decisive step toward him. "I'm not leaving because the contract is over. I'm staying, but no longer on your terms." Julian stared at her, his expression a mask of confusion. "What do you mean?" Helena took a deep, steadying breath before continuing. "I will not go tonight as your hired companion. If I go, it will be as the woman I actually am, not the one we invented for your facade." Her eyes shone with a fierce, unwavering determination. "And if I stay in your life after tonight, it won't be because of a contract or my brother's debt. It will be for me, for you, for us." The world seemed to grind to a halt around Julian. Helena's words echoed in the silent office, but his mind struggled to process their full, staggering meaning. Was she saying what he thought she was saying? "Helena, You don't have to answer now," she said, raising a hand to stop him. "But I need you to know that I'm not acting anymore. Everything I've felt these last few weeks, everything that happened in the Hudson Valley, the conversations, the looks, all of it was real for me. And I think it was for you too." Julian tried to speak, to form a coherent thought, but the words were trapped in his throat. A hurricane of emotions assailed him. Fear, hope, disbelief, and something far deeper that he still didn't dare to name. Helena walked to the door, but before leaving, she turned back one last time. "I'll be at my workshop until 7, if you want us to go to this gala together. As real people and not as characters in a play, you know where to find me. If you don't come," her voice trembled slightly, "I'll understand that you'd rather stick to your original plan." With those words, she was gone, leaving behind not only the shredded remains of their contract, but also the shattered pieces of the barrier they had both so carefully constructed for months. Julian stood frozen, staring at the closed door. For the first time in his adult life, he felt completely and utterly exposed, as if all of his defenses had been obliterated in a single devastating strike. Vulnerability wrapped around him like an unfamiliar blanket, both uncomfortable and strangely comforting. Sebastian entered minutes later, laden with more files. "Is everything all right?" he asked, seeing Julian standing motionless beside the desk. "I just passed Helena in the elevator. She seemed different." Julian nodded slowly, not looking at his friend. A strange sense of lightness was beginning to expand in his chest, replacing the crushing weight he had carried for so long. "Cancel my presentation for tonight," he said, his voice calm and clear. "What? You can't be serious. The Dubai contingent—" "I can reschedule," Julian interrupted, "or they can learn about our project without all the pageantry. If they're going to invest, it will be because of the proposal's actual merit, not because of the illusion I've been selling." Sebastian stared at him, as if he had lost his mind. "Do you have any idea what you're risking?" Julian finally turned to face his friend, and an unexpected smile illuminated his features. In his eyes, something shone that Sebastian hadn't seen in years. Peace. "For the first time in a very long time," Julian said, "I think I realize exactly what I'm winning." After Sebastian left, confused but resigned to follow his instructions, Julian walked to the window. The sun was beginning its descent over Manhattan, bathing the steel and glass towers in a golden light that reminded him of the color of Helena's eyes. Silent tears traced paths down his cheeks, not of sorrow, but of liberation. He knew exactly where he would be at 7 o'clock sharp. Spring had transformed Central Park into a vibrant oasis in the heart of New York City. Helena and Julian walked along the winding paths, pausing occasionally to watch the rowboats on the lake or to simply enjoy the warmth of the sun on their faces. Their intertwined hands were no longer part of a carefully rehearsed performance. They joined with the easy, unconscious comfort of two people who have found an unexpected sanctuary in one another. 3 weeks had passed since the night she had torn up their contract. 3 weeks in which they had discovered a life together, far removed from the glare of spotlights and the burden of appearances. To the astonishment of them both, the investors from Dubai had signed the preliminary agreement, even without the grand orchestrated presentation. "We prefer to do business with authentic people," Sheikh Al Maktoum had said, after an informal meeting where Julian, for the first time, had shown up without his mask. "Who would have ever imagined you'd be so comfortable making pasta from scratch?" Helena commented as they settled onto a bench overlooking the water. Julian smiled, remembering the dinner they'd made the previous night. He had cooked fettuccine using a recipe he recalled from his childhood, from watching his grandmother cook in her small apartment in Queens, long before the Vance name ever appeared in business journals. "My grandmother would be proud," he replied with a nostalgic smile, though she'd probably laugh at my attempt to replicate her secret sauce. "I liked it more than anything we ate at those Michelin-starred restaurants," Helena confessed, resting her head on his shoulder. These past few weeks, they had discovered a daily rhythm that neither had ever known. Julian had traded his endless business dinners for quiet nights at home. Helena had temporarily moved her work into the penthouse, transforming one of the empty, sterile rooms into a small, vibrant studio where she could design without pressure. In the mornings, they had breakfast together, watching the sun rise over the city. In the afternoons, when Julian returned from his now much more modest office, they would walk through Soho or explore different corners of the park. And at night, sometimes they cooked, other times they ordered takeout and watched old classic films, discovering overlaps and divergences in their tastes. "Sebastian says the financial press is baffled by my transformation," Julian remarked, as they watched a group of children feeding the ducks. "Apparently turning down exclusive parties to catch an indie band in Brooklyn or grab pizza in the village isn't what they expected from the real estate shark." Helena laughed, but she caught a hint of concern in his tone. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked, studying his face. Julian shook his head, his expression clear. "It's strange, but for the first time in years I feel free, as if I've been playing a role my entire adult life and I can finally just be myself." He leaned in and kissed her softly, a simple gesture that still surprised them both with its effortless intimacy. Le Bernardin, one of the city's most acclaimed and exclusive restaurants, was not the kind of place they frequented anymore. However, when Ricardo Montero, an old partner of Julian's and one of the few who hadn't completely turned his back on him, invited him to dinner to discuss a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Julian accepted out of courtesy. "I'll come with you," Helena offered as he adjusted his tie in front of the mirror. "You don't have to," he replied. "It'll just be a boring dinner full of numbers and projections. Besides, you need to finish those designs for that boutique in Charleston." Helena nodded, though a small shadow of unease crossed her features. They had been so immersed in their bubble of newfound happiness that they had almost forgotten about the outside world, with all its complications and temptations. That night, as she tried to work on her sketches, Helena couldn't focus. A gnawing premonition finally drove her to call a taxi and head to the restaurant. She didn't plan to interrupt, only to reassure herself that everything was all right. When she arrived, the maitre d' recognized her immediately and showed her toward the restaurant's private dining area. Helena paused just before the entrance, her attention caught by the conversation filtering through the slightly ajar doors. $50 million, Julian." Ricardo's voice was electric with enthusiasm. "Enough to get back everything you lost and then some. The Canadian investors are ready to back you completely." "It sounds too good to be true," Julian replied, his tone cautious. "That's because I haven't told you the one condition," Ricardo said, pausing for effect. "They need the old Julian Vance, the relentless one, the shark who stops at nothing and for no one, the man who built an empire without getting sidetracked by sentimental distractions." Helena felt her heart stop. Sentimental distractions? Julian's voice was dangerously quiet. "Come on, Julian, we're adults," Ricardo said, his voice lowering conspiratorially but still audible to Helena. "Your thing with the designer was useful when you needed to keep up appearances, but the Canadians have done their homework. They know it's real now, and they're worried you've lost your edge. They need the predator, not the man in love who takes strolls in Central Park and turns down major events to stay home." A heavy, suffocating silence followed. Helena waited, holding her breath, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. "And if I don't accept that condition?" Julian finally asked. Ricardo sighed, a sound of patronizing disappointment. "Then there's no deal, and this is probably your last real chance to reclaim everything you lost." Helena didn't need to hear any more. Her heart constricting in her chest, she backed away silently and fled the restaurant. The cold night air hit her face, mingling with the tears that were already streaming down her cheeks. She knew what that offer meant to Julian, knew how much he had suffered watching his life's work disintegrate. How could she possibly compete with the chance for him to get it all back? She returned to the penthouse and began to gather her things. It wasn't fair to put him in that position, to make him choose. Perhaps the kindest, most loving thing she could do was to disappear, to clear the path for him to become the man he was, before she ever entered his life. Julian walked into the apartment 2 hours later, calling her name. When he got no response, he headed to her makeshift studio and stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes falling on the half-packed suitcases and neatly stacked designs. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rough with dawning horror. Helena jumped, not having heard him come in. I thought it would be for the best," she answered, refusing to look at him. "Ricardo's offer, it's what you need. It's your chance to get back everything you lost because of Sterling and the others." He stared at her, his confusion slowly giving way to dawning comprehension. "You were there. You heard us." Helena nodded, finally meeting his gaze, her own eyes swimming with tears. "I don't want to be the person who stops you from reclaiming your life, Julian. I know how important it is to you. I know how hard you fought." "You don't know anything," he interrupted, closing the distance between them. "You don't know what I said to Ricardo after you left." He gently took her hands in his. "I told him I have no interest in being that man ever again. I told him that Julian Vance was alone, even when he was surrounded by people. I told him I would rather build something new, something real, than reclaim an empty empire built on illusions and loneliness." Fresh tears welled in Helena's eyes. "But everything you lost," Julian smiled, a deep, serene smile she had never seen before. "I don't want the world I lost, if you're not in it, Helena." His voice cracked slightly with emotion, "because without you, it wouldn't be a real world at all." Helena let the garment in her hand fall to the floor and threw herself into his arms. The embrace was fierce, desperate, as if they both feared the other might vanish. "I love you," she whispered against his chest, "and it terrifies me." Julian stroked her hair, breathing in her scent as if it were the very air he needed to survive. "I love you too," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "And it's the only thing I'm not afraid of anymore." Outside, New York City churned on, indifferent to the quiet revolution taking place in a penthouse on Park Avenue, where two people who had started with a cold contract were finally discovering what it meant to build a real world together. The sun was setting over Santa Barbara, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold that shimmered on the Pacific Ocean. From the terrace of their house nestled in the hills, the entire spectacle was on display. The sea stretching to the horizon, the red-tiled roofs cascading down the hillside, and the bay embracing the city like a protective mother. Helena surveyed the landscape as she placed the last flowers on the table set for dinner. In the 10 months since Julian had turned down a fortune to be with her, their lives had transformed in ways neither could have imagined. The house they now shared lacked the opulent grandeur of the Park Avenue penthouse, but it possessed something that place never had: a soul. Plants of every kind thrived in colorful pots, remnants of special fabrics adorned the walls like tapestries, and laughter flowed freely through the bright, airy rooms. It was a space they had built together, a true home. The glass doors slid open, and Julian walked in, loosening his tie and dropping his briefcase on the couch. Despite the weariness on his face, his eyes lit up when he saw her. "How was the first day?" Helena asked, walking over to kiss him. "Chaotic, exhilarating, terrifying. Exactly what we expected," he replied, wrapping her in a hug. "We have 28 students confirmed for the first semester, and 3 local companies are already interested in hiring our graduates." Helena smiled, a mix of pride and nostalgia welling up inside her. That day they had officially opened the New Horizons School of Design and Entrepreneurship in a repurposed warehouse in the city's arts district. The idea had emerged almost by accident during an impromptu vacation when they stumbled upon the abandoned building. What began as an offhand comment, "This place would be perfect for a workshop," had blossomed into a project that perfectly merged their talents, Helena's creative vision and Julian's business acumen. "Isla showed me the designs they worked on in class," Helena said, pouring him a glass of wine. "Some of those kids have incredible talent. They just needed a chance." That was the school's mission, to offer professional training in fashion design to young people from under-resourced communities, supplemented with entrepreneurial skills to help them launch their own businesses. Helena ran the creative and academic side, while Julian managed the administration and forged partnerships with local and national companies. The venture had consumed a significant portion of the funds Julian had secured from the Dubai investment, but to the surprise of many, including himself, he didn't miss the life of excess at all. The simplicity of his current existence had revealed a depth of happiness money could never buy. "Did you hear from Sebastian?" Helena asked as they sat down to dinner on the terrace under a canopy of stars. "He called this morning." Julian grinned, recalling the conversation. "He says Sterling is facing a federal investigation for that corruption scheme. Apparently someone anonymously leaked some very incriminating documents to the DOJ. Helena raised an eyebrow. "Someone? Someone who might have kept copies of a certain red folder," Julian replied, a mischievous glint in his eye. "But that could never be proven, of course." They both laughed, savoring the sweet justice that had finally caught up to the man who had orchestrated Julian's downfall. The night wore on peacefully, the sound of distant waves providing a gentle soundtrack. After dinner, they sat on the porch swing, watching the moon draw a silver path across the ocean. Julian wrapped his arm around Helena's shoulders, pulling her close. "Sometimes I wonder if any of this is real," he murmured, stroking her hair. "That one day I'll wake up in that empty penthouse, alone and bitter, only to discover that all of this was a dream." Helena laced her fingers through his. "This is real as the scars we both carry, and as real as the choices we make every single day to build this life, together." A gentle breeze carried the sweet fragrance of the bougainvillea that cascaded over their garden walls. Julian gazed at Helena's profile, illuminated by the moonlight, and marveled at the strange, unpredictable turns of fate. Everything he had once considered paramount, power, recognition, ostentatious wealth, now seemed hollow and insignificant compared to the profound sense of fullness he felt in this single moment. "Can I ask you something?" he said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Anything," she replied, turning to meet his eyes. "Do you still sew?" The question caught her by surprise. It had been months since her primary identity had shifted from seamstress to academic director and professor. Her daily life was now more about lesson plans and mentorship than the physical act of creation. Helena smiled with a deep tenderness, understanding the true meaning hidden beneath his simple question. She brought Julian's hand to her chest, placing it over her heart. "Every single day," she answered softly. "But now you are the one who clothes my heart. Every word, every touch, every look, they are the threads that stitch our lives together into a design I never could have imagined." Julian's eyes glistened with unshed emotion. He leaned into her, kissing her with the same intensity as their first kiss in the storm-swept Hudson Valley, but this time there were no fears, no contracts, no pretenses. It was a kiss of pure, unvarnished truth. "I love you, Helena Ross," he whispered against her lips. "Not in the way one loves a possession or a trophy, but in the way one loves freedom itself." "And I love you, Julian Vance," she answered, her voice steady and sure. "Not for the man you were, or the man you could have been, but for the man you are when no one else is watching." The night wrapped them in its starry mantle as they held each other, completely at peace with the path they had chosen. In the distance, the lights of Santa Barbara twinkled, a gentle reminder that the world, with all its complexities and challenges, was still out there. But they would face it together, sewing a shared destiny day by day with threads of truth, respect, and a love that had been born from a lie only to blossom into the most authentic of realities. The next day they would return to their school to continue building the project that gave their lives purpose and others opportunity. But tonight, in this perfect, suspended moment, They were simply a man and a woman who had learned life's most vital lesson, that true wealth is not found in owning the world, but in sharing it with the one person who makes your heart feel like it's finally come home. The dawn light filtered through the linen curtains, casting shifting patterns across the bedroom walls. Helena opened her eyes slowly, adjusting to the brightness as she felt the steady weight of Julian's arm around her waist. 5 years had passed since they had opened the school in Santa Barbara. 5 years of building a life together that neither of them could have foreseen when they'd signed a contract that was meant to be nothing but a facade. She rose carefully, not wanting to wake him. Julian had gotten home late the previous night after a meeting with potential donors for the school's scholarship fund. At 50, he still possessed the relentless drive and determination that had made him a titan of industry. But now that formidable energy was channeled into a purpose that extended far beyond the accumulation of personal wealth and power. Helena walked to the window and gazed at the horizon, where the Pacific Ocean melted into the sky in a soft, hazy line. The house they shared had expanded over the years, a larger, light-filled studio for her, a quiet library for him, and most recently, a room decorated in soft, gentle colors, with handcrafted mobiles hanging from the ceiling. The room that was waiting for Sophia, the 3-year-old girl they were in the process of adopting, after meeting her at one of the local children's homes they supported. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was Lucia, the very first graduate of their school, and now the creative director of the fashion line they had launched under the New Horizons name. The garments, designed and produced by students and alumni, were sold in select boutiques across the country, and were beginning to gain international acclaim for their commitment to fair trade and sustainability. The buyers from Nordstrom confirmed, the text read, they want the entire collection for the fall season. We did it, Professor. Helena smiled, remembering the shy young woman who had arrived at their school from a small town in the Central Valley, armed with extraordinary talent but crippled by self-doubt. Now, Lucia was leading a team of 15 designers and was being hailed as one of the brightest new voices in contemporary American fashion. Good news, I take it? Julian's husky voice startled her. He was awake, watching her from the bed with that same look that, even after all these years, still made her heart beat a little faster. Lucia closed the Nordstrom deal, Helena replied, walking over to kiss him. The collection will be in all their stores starting in September. Julian pulled her into a proud embrace. I always knew she would. She has your same fire. Breakfast on the terrace overlooking the ocean was a ritual they both cherished whenever their schedules allowed. They shared coffee, fresh fruit and warm bread while reviewing the day's agenda. The simple domesticity of these moments still felt like a quiet miracle to Julian, who had spent decades eating breakfast alone in sterile restaurants or during tense board meetings. Sebastian called last night, he commented, spreading homemade jam on a slice of toast. The foundation received its international certification. We can now accept donations from overseas without the tax complications. The Vance Ross Foundation had been established 3 years prior as a natural extension of the school, with the mission of providing comprehensive support to artisan communities across the United States. They didn't just offer technical training, they also provided legal aid to protect traditional designs, access to fair trade markets, and health programs for artisan families. Perfect for the expansion into the Southwest, Helena replied thoughtfully. The Navajo weavers in Arizona urgently need that kind of legal protection for their designs. The project in the Southwest was particularly important to Helena. She had met the weavers during a research trip and had been awestruck by the intricate beauty of their ancestral techniques. She had also learned how large corporations frequently stole their designs with neither credit nor compensation. By the way, Julian said, checking his tablet, the lawyers from the city are arriving today to sign the final adoption papers. They'll be here at 11. A wave of nervous excitement washed over Helena. After months of paperwork, interviews and home visits, they were finally one step away from officially becoming Sophia's parents. The little girl, with her big dark eyes and infectious laugh, had captured their hearts from their very first meeting at the Hope House Children's Home. Do you think we'll be ready? Helena asked, voicing the quiet insecurity they both shared but rarely expressed. To be parents, I mean. Julian took her hand across the table, stroking it with his thumb in that familiar gesture that had become his silent way of offering reassurance. We'll probably make mistakes every single day, he answered with quiet honesty, but we will love her unconditionally, and I think that's the most important thing. Helena nodded, recognizing the simple wisdom in his words. If they had learned anything in their years together, it was that true love wasn't about perfection, but about the unwavering commitment to grow and learn day after day. The main campus of the New Horizons School of Design and Entrepreneurship had grown considerably from its humble beginnings. What had started as a single renovated warehouse was now a complex of 3 buildings, housing specialized workshops, classrooms, a small gallery for exhibitions, and a co-working space where graduates could develop their businesses with ongoing mentorship. Helena walked the halls greeting students and faculty. Unlike traditional institutions, there was no rigid hierarchy here. Advanced students mentored beginners, local artisans shared ancestral techniques with contemporary designers, and successful entrepreneurs volunteered their time to advise on the business side of fashion. In one of the main workshops, a group of students was working on a capsule collection for a Day of the Dead celebration, fusing traditional embroidery with modern silhouettes. Professor Ross, called Marisol, a 19-year-old student from a local Chumash community, "Could you help us with the beadwork for this piece? We want to incorporate symbols from our heritage, but adapt them to a contemporary cut." Helena sat with the students, the fabric in her hands feeling as natural as an extension of her own body. As she explained techniques and suggested modifications, she couldn't help but remember her own beginnings in that small Soho workshop, struggling to keep the business afloat while paying off her brother's debt. Life had come full circle in so many ways. Matthew, her brother, had reappeared 2 years ago, remorseful and sober, after a long recovery process. He now worked for their foundation, coordinating job placement programs for others in recovery. Forgiveness hadn't been easy, but Helena had discovered that the capacity for redemption was one of the human qualities she valued most. At noon, Julian appeared at the workshop door. His presence still commanded respect, but it was no longer the fear he had once inspired as the real estate shark. The students greeted him with genuine affection, knowing that beneath his formal exterior was a man deeply invested in their personal and professional growth. "Ready to go meet our daughter?" he asked as she approached, a mix of nerves and anticipation in his voice. The lawyers had confirmed everything was in order. After the signing, they could go directly to the children's home to bring Sophia to her new home. "I'll never be completely ready," Helena answered with a trembling smile, "but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The drive to the county courthouse was filled with an emotional, expectant silence. Helena gazed at the familiar Santa Barbara landscape, the city they had chosen for their reinvention, now poised to be the backdrop where a little girl who had lost everything would find a family. "Do you remember when we signed that other contract?" Julian asked suddenly as they waited at a red light. "The one that bound us together for 3 months in a complete farce." Helena laughed softly at the irony. "Who would have thought we'd end up signing papers to become a real family?" Julian lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it with reverence. "I think I started loving you the moment you refused to look down when you spoke to me. I was just too proud and too foolish to admit it." The courthouse was a beautifully restored Spanish colonial building in the heart of downtown. The procedure itself was surprisingly brief for something so life-altering. Signatures, seals, legal oaths, and then, just like that, they were officially parents. 2 hours later, they stood before Hope House, a cheerful building painted in bright colors, its garden filled with children playing under the watchful eyes of caregivers. Sophia was waiting for them in the director's office, wearing a little yellow dress and white sandals, her dark hair in 2 pigtails tied with ribbons. When the little girl saw them, her face lit up with recognition. Over the past few months, they had built a bond through weekly visits, sometimes taking her for walks on the beach or for a few hours at their house to familiarize her with her new environment. "Are we going home now?" Sophia asked with the guileless clarity of a child. Helena knelt down to her level, fighting back tears. "Yes, my love, we're going home. Forever." Julian joined them, creating a small circle that symbolized the family they had just created. In his arms, Sophia seemed both impossibly small and immeasurably significant. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one neither of them had ever planned, but one they now couldn't imagine living without. Night had fallen over Santa Barbara. From Sophia's room came the last whispered words of the story Julian was reading her, a tradition they had established during their first visits. Helena was putting away some clothes in her daughter's small but well-stocked closet. Tucked among the new outfits, she found a little doll dress that Sophia had brought with her, her only possession from her previous life. It was worn and poorly stitched, likely a volunteer's clumsy attempt at a repair. Carefully, Helena retrieved her sewing kit. She began to reinforce the seams, mend the tiny tears, and add a few decorative stitches she knew Sophia would love. Her fingers moved with their lifelong precision, but now every stitch felt imbued with a new and sacred meaning. Julian found her there when he came out of Sophia's room. "She's asleep," he announced softly, watching Helena's hands. "What are you doing?" "Mending her past, I suppose," she replied, holding up the doll's dress, "so she can carry it into her future without it falling apart." He sat beside her, mesmerized by the way her hands worked, a fusion of strength and delicacy that had always captivated him. "You're extraordinary. You know that?" he said with sincere admiration. "You've taken every broken piece of our lives and stitched it into something beautiful." Helena finished the last stitch and snipped the thread. The doll's dress, now whole and embellished, held the essence of what it had been, yet also the promise of what it could become. "It's what we do when we love," she answered simply. "We care for the broken threads and create new patterns." That night, as Sophia slept soundly in her new room and the moon cast its light upon the ocean, Helena and Julian sat on the porch swing, held in a familiar embrace. The life they had woven together wasn't flawless. It had patches, visible seams, even a few carefully repaired tears. But it was authentic. It was theirs. And every day, with patience and love, they added new threads, creating a tapestry that no longer just sheltered the two of them, but also a little girl who needed a home, students who sought opportunity, and communities fighting to preserve their heritage. On the horizon, the lights of distant ships flickered like fallen stars. Julian kissed Helena's forehead and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me that true success isn't what you build, but who you allow inside what you have built." Helena smiled, leaning her head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "And thank you for showing me that even the most painful falls can land you exactly where you were always meant to be." The wind carried the scent of night-blooming jasmine and sea salt as Santa Barbara slept under its blanket of stars. In a house on a hill, a family, newly official but bound by ties stronger than any document, rested in the quiet certainty that some endings are, in fact, the most beautiful beginnings of all.